Good afternoon. I'm Bill Griswold, director of the Cleveland Museum of Art, and I am delighted to welcome you to the museum and to this year's third annual Pauline and Joseph Degenfelder Distinguished Lecture in Chinese Art. This lecture is made possible by the Pauline and Joseph Degenfelder Family Endowment Fund, and we are profoundly indebted to Pauline and Joseph and their family, many of whom are here with us today, for their visionary support of the generation and dissemination of new scholarship. It's thanks to their generosity that each year we're able to bring to Cleveland an outstanding scholar in the field of Chinese art in order that he or she may present important research and innovative perspectives on topics that relate to the 5,000-year history of art in China. And it is a particular pleasure this afternoon for me to recognize Pauline and Joseph and to congratulate Joe, who's celebrating a milestone birthday. Pauline, Joe. This museum's collection of Chinese art is highly regarded all over the world, as I think all those in this audience know. For generations, that collection has been accessible free of charge to all those who visit the museum. And in January, as some of you may know, we made our entire collection available to all by means of open access, thereby bringing our mission of global service firmly into the digital age. Today, people who may never have the chance to walk through our doors are instead able to download high-resolution images of masterpieces in our collection, making access universal, whether one lives in Cleveland or Beijing or Chengdu. Images enable one to travel the world, and this afternoon's lecture will bring to Cleveland images of Buddhist art from a remarkable site on the eastern part of the Silk Road. And our speaker, Mimi Gates, is a friend and a colleague and a great scholar. To introduce her to you today, I'm pleased to give the podium to Clarissa von Spee, our James and Donna Reed Curator of Chinese Art and Chair of the museum's renowned Department of the Arts of Asia. Dr. von Spee joined us 3 years ago in 2016, having previously served as curator of the Chinese and Central Asian collections at the British Museum. Already she's made wonderful acquisitions and installed a series of sensitive rotations of Chinese art in our galleries, and she's currently hard at work on exhibitions ranging from a presentation this summer of the work of Chinese-born contemporary artist Tsai Guo-Qiang, to an international loan show of treasures from the lower Yangtze Delta, which will open in Cleveland in just a couple of years. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the podium our curator, Clarissa von Spee.
Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you today a much admired friend and senior colleague, Dr. Mimi Gardner Gates, Director Emeritus of the Seattle Art Museum and Chair of the Dunhuang Foundation. It was during my time in London at the British Museum when I was curator for the Dunhuang silk paintings, prints, and textiles preserved at the British Museum when I traveled with Mimi to Dunhuang. And when she initiated the seminal exhibition Cave Temples of Dunhuang, Buddhist Art on China's Silk Road at the Getty Institute in 2016. This exhibition, which perhaps some of you saw in Los Angeles, has introduced the UNESCO World Heritage site of the Mogao Caves in Dunhuang to a wide American audience. And it was also one of the first exhibitions that documented the challenging conservation measurements undertaken by the Dunhuang Academy and in collaboration with the Getty Institute in Los Angeles to preserve these caves for future generations. Mimi Gates is a scholar of the history of Chinese art with a BA from Stanford University and a PhD from Yale University. Prior to moving to Seattle, she was curator of Asian art at the Yale University Art Gallery from 1975 to 1986, and then director of the Yale University Art Gallery from 1987 to 1994. Under her leadership and during her 15 remarkable years as director of the Seattle Art Museum from 1994 to 2009, the Olympic Sculpture Park was created, the Downtown Museum was expanded, and the artistic program achieved a high level of excellence. Currently, Dr. Gates chairs the Dunhuang Foundation and the Board of Managers of the Blakemore Foundation. She is a member of, or was a member of the board of the Terra Foundation for American Art and is member of the board of the San Francisco Asian Art Museum, the Northwest African American Museum, and Copper Canyon Press. Mimi Gates is also a former fellow of the Yale Corporation and founder of the Gardner Center for Asian Art and Ideas at the Seattle Art Museum. We are especially honored and delighted that Mimi recently accepted our invitation to be a member of the CMA's International Council. Today, Dr. Gates will take us to the Mogao Caves in Dunhuang on China's Silk Road in her lecture, Caves of Dunhuang, Buddhist Art on China's Silk Road. Please welcome Dr. Mimi Gates.
Thank you, Bill and Clarissa. It's really a delight to be here, and I want to add my congratulations to Mr. Degenfelder, his birthday wishes. It's an honor to be here to give this lecture, and a particular delight to be in Cleveland. I am just completely overwhelmed with the beauty of this museum, the number of extraordinary works of art you have in this collection that certainly is a source of great pride for this city and for this state. I'm an Ohio native. I was born in Dayton and spent the first 15 years of my life there. Another connection we have is through Sherman Lee, who prior to directing this museum, he was the associate director of the Seattle Art Museum from 1948 to 1952. And if you look through the Seattle Art Museum's collection, you will see Sherman Lee's extraordinary eye for art reflected in the collection from the acquisitions he made for Seattle during his tenure as associate director. Among the many treasures you have on view in this museum is an exquisite 12th century Chinese painting in gold on indigo paper, which originally served as the frontispiece for a copy of the Lotus Sutra, a highly influential sacred text of Mahayana Buddhism, which is comparable to a Christian scripture. An absolutely beautiful work of art. Among many other teachings of the Buddha, the Lotus Sutra describes the myriad benefits that accrue to those who recite, copy, and revere this sutra. So take a close look, and you can look at the detail in the painting, which is extraordinary. There's even a lady painting in the back. And also, don't miss the Shinto exhibition, which I'm sure most of you have seen, which Curator Chenet organized, which is absolutely extraordinary. Soon after stepping down as director of the Seattle Art Museum in 2009, I was invited by the Dunhuang Academy to give a paper at a symposium at Dunhuang in China. And being a student of the history of Chinese art, I spent every moment I could visiting the grottos, caves chock-a-block full of art, and developed a singular passion for the site for the Buddhist caves in the region of Dunhuang, which is on the Chinese end of the Silk Roads. And subsequently, at the request of the Dunhuang Academy, as Clarissa said, I established the Dunhuang Foundation, US, which supports the training of Chinese wall painting conservators and other preservation efforts, digitization, scholarly exchange, and artist residencies, programs not supported by the Chinese government. And as chair of the Dunhuang Foundation, I take people on VIP trips to China several times a year. In 2016, I was part of a team. Clarissa mentioned the exhibition at the Getty Trust in Los Angeles, which focused on Dunhuang. And Clarissa was also involved because as curator of the collection at the British Museum, she oversaw a significant number of works of art from the Dunhuang caves, from the library cave, which I'll talk about momentarily. And certainly the British Museum lent very generously. So this afternoon, I'd like to focus on the Buddhist caves of Dunhuang, which is a remarkable UNESCO World Heritage Site in northwest China, which represents a rich resource on the Silk Roads of early Chinese art. And first, I will introduce the Buddhist caves of the Dunhuang region and their art, and concentrating on the 5th to the 8th centuries, and from the earliest caves to the height of the Tang Dynasty. And actually what you see here is a wonderful 8th century ceiling from one of the caves in Dunhuang. They're covered completely, the walls, the ceiling, with these remarkable wall paintings. What is Dunhuang and where is it located? Why were over 500 art-filled Buddhist grottos from the first millennium built at this remote location? Who created them and why? Secondly, I'll tell you the intriguing story of how they were rediscovered at the turn of the 20th century. And finally, we will consider what is being done today to conserve and preserve these magnificent caves and their art. What are the challenges that threaten the site, and how are they being addressed? Silk Road was a term coined in 1877 by German explorer Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen, and to refer to the trade routes that stretch across the vast Eurasian landmass, which extends from China to the Mediterranean world. So these intersecting trade routes. So let me situate you in order to give you some idea of where Dunhuang is. Here is Beijing, Xi'an, where the Terracotta Army is located. This is the Heshi Corridor, which is a corridor through which there are rivers and water between the Gobi Desert and to the north, and also the Siberian steppes, and to South Tibet, the Tibetan Plateau, and the Himalayan mountains. And these routes went across harsh, unforgiving deserts. The Gobi, the Taklamakan Desert was known to be particularly difficult to navigate. So, and another map that really gives you a sense of how many intersecting trade routes there were. We tend to think of this as being the global age, but in the first millennium, people traveled vast distances, and there were many trade routes. When you say Silk Road, it really is Silk Roads. It's not a single route. And today, Central Asia, which was formerly considered a wasteland, it's just beginning to emerge on the world stage. However, throughout the first millennium, Central Asia was a site of sophisticated civilizations and sizable cities. And in these cities and along the trade routes were found a vibrant mix of religions and nationalities. Persians, Turks, Uyghurs, Sogdians, which were an Iranic people who don't exist anymore, Indian, and Chinese. The distinguished historian Victor Mayer has written, and I quote, "Dunhuang was a place of intense interchange amongst a wide variety of peoples," end of quote. So here is Dunhuang at a strategic location on the Chinese end of the Silk Road. It was a military garrison of Chinese soldiers who were stationed there since the 1st century AD to protect the frontier. Chinese language was always the most important language, followed by Tibetan, but there were just this rich variety of languages that were spoken. And from the 4th to the 14th century, for over 1,000 years, Dunhuang was a lively cosmopolitan place where East met West, and where 4 major cultures, Greek and Roman via Gandhara, Persian and Middle Eastern, Indian and Chinese, all these cultures intermingled with one another at Dunhuang. So a view of a merchant caravan in 1907. And travelers left China for Central Asia and the Mediterranean world. They had to deal not only with harsh climate, sandstorms, shortage of water, frostbite in the mountains, and difficult terrain, but also they were vulnerable to bandits. Few merchants traveled the entire distance. They actually went from oasis to oasis, and middlemen at the various oases, a succession of middlemen, then sold the goods onward to people traveling the next leg of the route. Heading west from China toward the Mediterranean world, caravans of merchants carried silk, furs, ceramics, jades, and spices. Heading east from the Mediterranean world toward China, they brought ivory, gems, and gold, among many other luxury goods. Persian glass, you see all sorts of luxury goods that were made in the West in the paintings at Dunhuang. And Dunhuang enjoyed considerable prosperity because the merchant caravans stocked their provisions at Dunhuang, supplies of food and water, and it really was a thriving metropolis. So Buddhism first arrived in China around the 1st century of our era, and thereafter was disseminated throughout East Asia. It also came by other routes, by sea and overland through the south. But once disseminated, Buddhist texts were translated into Chinese. Buddhist monks, nuns, and pilgrims traveled from China to North India and Nepal. So along these routes going across the Eurasian landmass, you had not only merchants, but also monks and lay people who were going to see firsthand the famous places where Gautama Buddha, the historic Buddha who lived and taught in the 6th, 5th century before the Common Era. And Indian monks came to China to disseminate their faith. So Buddhist practices and thought flowed in 2 directions, eastward into China from India and back again. So when and how did cave building at Dunhuang start? And what you see here is the translation of a 7th century inscription on a large stone tablet in one of the Dunhuang caves. And it reads, "In 366, a wandering monk named Luzun, resolute and calm and of pure conduct, traveling the wilds with his pilgrim staff, arrived at this mountain and had a vision of golden radiance in the form of 1,000 Buddhas. Thereupon he erected scaffolding and chiseled out the cliff to make a cave." End of quote. So then a second monk arrived and joined him, and cave construction continued for the next 1,000 years. So the ink drawing of a monk with shoes and water bottle that in the collection of the British Museum is amongst the works that were found in the famous library cave at Dunhuang, and as I said, I'll tell you that story momentarily. But the tradition of cave building originated in India, cut out of rock cliffs by Buddhist, Hindus, and Jains. So Ajanta Caves is one of the important predecessors of Dunhuang. It's located near Aurangabad, not far from Mumbai or Bombay. And the periodization is somewhat subject to debate, but it's generally thought that the first period is around the 1st century before the Common Era, the later between around the 5th century of our era. And the wonderful princely bodhisattva that you see on the left, and these caves cut into the mountain. And influences flowed back and forth continuously over the centuries. So I'm just going to show you one slide that is from the Dunhuang region, but reflects a separate wave of influence, in this case from Pala, India. These are 11th, 12th century, so they're later from the Eastern Thousand Buddha caves near Dunhuang. But these wonderful paintings of a female leaning on a tree. You can just barely see that the patterns on the stockings. The first time, this is a site which has not been terribly well preserved, but these two paintings are. And actually the leggings of our pattern, the first time I saw them, I thought it was maybe the first occurrence of patterned stockings, but in fact, they're transparent pants. So back to the tradition of cave building. Bamiyan in Afghanistan is certainly was one of the primary sites as Buddhism came eastward across Central Asia. And it was there where there were two monumental Buddhas that were carved out of the cliff between the 3rd and the 5th century AD. And sadly, as no doubt many of you are aware, they were destroyed by the Taliban in 2001. And it gives you some idea of the fragility of the world's cultural heritage. I have to say, I was really fortunate. In 1966, I drove with my husband across from Paris to India, and we actually went to Bamiyan. So I had the wonderful experience of seeing those Buddhas firsthand. So let's look at Dunhuang. While there are multiple cave complexes located in the Dunhuang region and all across Central Asia, Mogao is the World Heritage Site, and it's a 1-mile-long cliff face that is located 9 miles outside the town of Dunhuang. And today, while there were originally there were thought to be over 1,000 caves, today roughly 750 caves survived, which is quite remarkable. And as there are other cave sites in China and Central Asia, but nowhere else can you find such a large number of caves that span a millennium. These are the northern caves, which were the living quarters of the monks. They were places for meditation and religious practice, and also in some cases, monks were buried there. They're largely undecorated, and what you see is the original cliff face. Whereas the southern caves include 492 caves chock-a-block full of art. And in the early 1960s, the cliff face, and I'll show you a picture in a bit, the cliff face was crumbling, so Zhou Enlai actually had the government make a major investment in reinforcing the cliff face. So 492 caves filled with art, more than 45,000 square meters of wall painting, over 2,000 sculptures. it stands out as the greatest repository of early Chinese art, and I always like to think of it as one of the great museums of the world. So for Buddhist believers, commissioning a cave was a form of devotion. Why were they created? It was a form of devotion, a well-established way to gain merit in the afterworld for oneself and for one's deceased relatives, for one's parents. So also for monks and merchants who were departing across this rough terrain, it was also a form of prayer to request safe journey across all the treacherous deserts and mountains. Or for those returning, when they arrived at Dunhuang, it was a way to give thanks to the Buddha for a safe return. So I think what's so important is to realize this is a site that is not art for art's sake, but these were sacred spaces which are filled with devotional art. And one of the standard types of caves in the early period is a central pillar cave. There's a central pillar, and Buddhist devotees paid homage to the Buddha by walking around the central pillar with their right shoulder to the pillar, chanting prayers as they walked. It's still a Buddhist practice called circumambulation, and there are a good number of these caves in Dunhuang. One interesting question is the authenticity of early Chinese art, which is a problem in many cases. But at Dunhuang, there's no question that they're authentic. They're by anonymous painters of the time. We don't know their names. It's the same as the great cathedrals of Europe. But sometimes you do have different layers done in different centuries, but those are authentic from that particular time. So what I want to do is just take a brief look to acquaint you with the artistic richness of the site and look at painting and sculpture from the 5th to the 8th century. So one of the best preserved early caves is from the first half of the 5th century, cave 275. And here it's stylistic influences from what we call the Western regions, which is from India across Central Asia, which dominate. And in fact, I can't show you all the details of the cave, but it's modeled on a Chaitya cave of India, which actually exists at Ajanta. But the painting styles that you see here are also very close to the paintings at the site of Kizil in the Xinjiang region of China. It's very loosely composed. And look at how these are very small donors. One thing that's interesting in Dunhuang over time, as the time goes on, the donors get bigger and bigger, which is quite funny. And by the time you get to the 10th century, they're actually life-size. So it's quite interesting. But the Buddha you see here is actually quite close to the Buddhas of Bamiyan, and the string drapery of his dhoti, which is an Indian style of dress, is quite similar. The crown it is modeled on a Persian crown, the triangular backrest, and the textile pattern also come from the Western regions. But by the time you get to the 6th century and into Northern and Western Way, you can begin to see Chinese influence coming. Chinese from the art of central China. And this beautiful meditating Buddha from cave 259 now wears a Chinese robe, the hands in the meditating mudra, and the very refined sculptural styles that relate as much to what you find in central China at the time, much more so than what you find in Central Asia. and this wonderful way that the incised lines of the drapery unify the whole body. So, and Bodhisattva, who is a being who aspires, who will attain Buddhahood, but waits until all humankind is saved before going to nirvana, is also very, very refined, the drapery very graceful, the way the scarves hang over the figure. So how are these figures made? The cliff face is soft conglomerate. That means it was made of small pebbles, and they're held together in a matrix, but you can't carve it the way you can solid rock. So the sculptures are built on a wooden armature that's covered with straw, then with a mixture of straw and clay, and the clay is really mud from the local riverbed, and then it's sculpted in finer mud, and then in a fine white layer and painted. So it's quite remarkable that they have survived all these centuries. So how are the paintings made? So this is the layer of conglomerate of small pebbles in a matrix, then the mud and straw, and then this pure, much finer mud clay, and finally a thin white layer that's like talc. And then the paintings were sketched in ink, and then filled in color. So that gives you some idea of how they were made. And the mineral pigments were largely mineral, which means that they have been located in dark caves. They actually have retained their color over the centuries. So the early caves have many narratives. The Buddhist tradition is full of rich narratives and about the previous lives of the Buddha. This is a Jataka tale, a story from one of the previous lives of the Buddha. It's perhaps one of the most famous paintings at Dunhuang. That is the story of the 9-colored deer. And the deer saves a man from drowning. And afterwards, the man asks the deer how he can repay him. And the deer says, "Don't tell anybody my whereabouts." The next section you can't see in this image, but he goes back to, he goes home, and the king and queen, the queen wants a coat made out of the fur of a 9-colored deer. And the king is offering a large reward. He can't pass it up. He can't restrain himself. So he tells the king where the deer is and takes him to him. And this is the king. The deer is sleeping, then the deer talking to the king. There's this continuous narration. And the king, once he hears the story, he declares that the deer will be forever protected. And that's the Buddha in one of his earlier incarnations that lead up to him becoming the Buddha. And what you see here also is early Chinese landscape painting, the creation of space cells in which the different parts of the story take place. It also, the Chinese composer Tan Dun has recently composed a work called Buddha Passion, and it was performed in Los Angeles recently. There's an entire movement dedicated to the 9-colored deer. But perhaps the most spectacular of the early caves is Cave 285, which is the earliest dated cave. It has 2 inscriptions on this wall that are dated 538 and 539. And so in the first half of the 6th century. And it's this expansive space. It's always hard to tell in slides. It's about 6 meters square. And the cells on the northern side and the southern side are for meditation, where a single person could meditate. And it's just sumptuously decorated. This whirling celestial regions. At the center is a lotus flower in what we term a lantern-deca ceiling, and on the outside, these hanging tassels like a canopy. And the ceiling is filled with traditional Chinese mythological creatures, a celestial realm that comes alive and seems to be in perpetual movement. And the blue is lapis lazuli, which was imported from Afghanistan. And here in a detail, the monk, it's one of the monks from this upper band. You can get some idea of the vibrancy of the color in these wall paintings from Dunhuang. And in that same cave is another Buddhist story, a traditional story of the conversion of the 500 bandits who are represented by 5, and they've been captured, and then their eyes are gouged out as punishment, so they're blinded. And then they cry for help to the Buddha, who restores their eyesight, and eventually they convert to Buddhism. So that probably is a predictable outcome. One of the reasons I wanted to show you this is that there's so much information that's embedded in the Dunhuang paintings. For example, this is used extensively in the study and research of Chinese armor of the period. So moving on into the 7th century, these early Tang period, and the Sui and Tang dynasty from the 7th to the early 10th century really witnessed the peak of cave building at Dunhuang, and it coincided with 3 centuries of peace. And as the Chinese Empire expanded into Central Asia, activity along the Silk Roads thrived, and Dunhuang prospered as a cosmopolitan city. And as I said before, whereas Sui and Tang art, early Chinese art, is scarce in central China, most of it having been destroyed. At Dunhuang, it's plentiful. This cave, Cave 57, is known as the Cave of the Beautiful People. And it's because of a group of really beautifully painted figures. Bodhisattva, these figures that accompany the Buddha. Just look at the textiles and the gold, which is impasto, and as such sticks out from the wall. But just these beautiful figures. Ananda, who is the Buddha's youngest disciple, and has here in both figures you can see these very, very delicate light organic washes. The pink that covers their faces and the various areas of their flesh. And here you have a Persian glass bowl that's transparent, that he's holding a translucent, holding in his hand. So moving on into the 8th century, Cave 328, actually Cave 7th, 8th, is a devotional image of a Buddha surrounded by what was originally 8 figures. And whereas in the early caves you have a single Buddha at the center, now you have a whole group that's evolved over time. And this actually is missing one figure, which Dunhuang has not had a lot of losses and pillaging. But Langdon Warner, who was there in the 20s, took 12 painting fragments and one sculpture, which was this Buddha. And actually, they're now at the Harvard Fine Arts Museums. But you can see these very beautiful attenuated figures. By the Tang Dynasty, these beautifully articulated faces and bodies. And the Buddha with this beautifully sculpted drapery. And when you think that it's over a wooden armature, it's quite extraordinary, the skill with which it's done, and the kneeling bodhisattva, which sits on the side. And one of the really great Tang caves is this Buddha Nirvana, the Buddha having reached enlightenment and his rebirth extinguished. This is, you get a sense of serenity, of peaceful rest from the face of the Buddha, which is beautifully delineated in terms of the sharp eyes, the very full sensual lips, and then the headdress, which has medallions on it, which are very similar to Middle Eastern textiles, Persian textiles. They have a bird with a string of jewels in its mouth that hang, and the Buddha is 16 meters long. So the whole idea of monumentality that you see at Bamiyan continues in Cave 158 and also in two large caves, in Cave 130 and Cave 96. This is 27 meters high. Cave 96 is 34.5 meters high. So these huge Buddhas cut in the cliff. And in the monumental images, the cliff, cliff is used for the core of the figures. And it's easy to understand the idea of monumentality, how it instills awe in a devotee, in a believer. And you can see the round face, the substantial body. And one reason I particularly like this monumental Buddha is the fingers of the hand are so gracefully modeled. This was just reopened after several years of being conserved. So what form of Buddhism was practiced at Dunhuang in China and East Asia? So the historic Buddha Gautama was born in Nepal in the 5th or 6th century before the Common Era. And as I said earlier, in the 1st century of our era, his teachings made their way to China. He taught that existence is suffering, and the path toward the cessation of suffering is through the cultivation of morality, meditation, and wisdom that lead to final rebirth and entry into nirvana. And in the 1st century of our era, that had great appeal, and particularly after the end of the Han Dynasty with the disruption in the 6 dynasties between Han and Tang. This provided a whole vision of an afterlife, and you didn't need to be a monk or an arhat to achieve it. Anyone could become a Buddha. So the Bodhisattva, the one on the left, is in Cave 45 at Dunhuang, and you can see this very typical sort of thrown hip to one side, and downcast eyes, beautifully sculpted face and painted. And I couldn't resist showing you a wonderful sculpture in your collection of a standing bodhisattva that Clarissa has brought out on view with the scarves gracefully draped over the arm, the same slung hip and downcast eyes, and really quite a marvelous piece. So what is the story of the rediscovery? of the caves at the turn of the 20th century. This is what Dunhuang looked like in 1907 when Sir Aurel Stein arrived. So after the 14th century, when the Mongol Empire broke up and Central Asia became increasingly arid, the Chinese pulled out of Central Asia. The Chinese pulled out of Dunhuang because of the overland Silk Road was no longer safe, and sea routes replaced the overland trade route. So from the 14th to the 20th century, these caves laid largely undisturbed, and it's what we refer to as the period of abandonment. The land around the caves was turned into pasture land. The remoteness from the turmoil that was taking place in central China and the extreme dryness helped preserve the caves and their art. Nevertheless, the sand blew across the steppes, accumulated in the caves, and the cliff face deteriorated. So by the early 20th century, when this photograph was taken, Dunhuang was long forgotten. But an event that stands out, actually not only in the history of Dunhuang, but in the history of modern China, is the Taoist monk Wang, who you see here on the left, his discovery of the library cave in 1900. Taoist Wang was an impoverished monk, and he was the self-appointed guardian of the Mogao caves. China was in chaos, and he lived at the caves. And he was clearing away the entrance to a cave, cave 16, and he knocked on the wall and realized that it was hollow behind it. So he came back at night, and he punched through, and he found a storeroom, now referred to the library cave, filled with more than 50,000 objects. Rolled manuscripts and embroideries, paintings, sketches. I mean, just a vast storehouse of all types of material, and had been undisturbed since the 11th century. The last dated object in the room is a manuscript dated 1002. So he was unable to get, so the library cave is right where the light is, right in here. It's not a large space. And unfortunately, nobody took pictures of exactly what it looked like when it was first found. But Aurel Stein came, he saw it, and he befriended the monk. And here actually he's with his dog Stash and Sping Khan. He always traveled with them. But Taoist Wang couldn't get the attention of the Chinese authorities. He tried to get them to recognize the value of the find, but instead it was the foreign explorers who got wind of this stunning find and gravitated to Dunhuang. And actually there's a great book by an author named Peter Hopkirk called Foreign Devils of the Silk Road that's available in paperback. It reads like a wonderful adventure. It was all part of the great game of different adventurers from rival powers seeking treasure in the 19th, early 20th century. Aurel Stein was an intrepid Hungarian. He, who later became a British citizen. The reason he's Sir Mark Aurel Stein is because of this find. And for 4 horseshoes of silver, he purchased almost 20,000 objects, which are now in London in the British Library and the British Museum. And the British Raj in India had also helped to fund his expedition, so some are also in the National Museum of New Delhi. And I'll just show you one object from his purchase, which is the Diamond Sutra, which is the earliest dated complete woodblock printed book in the world. And the frontispiece depicts a debate between the Buddha and Sariputra, the monk, asking him about the nature, the significance of existence. And the Buddha responds in the Diamond Sutra, "This fleeting life is like a star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, a phantom, and a dream." End of quote. And at the end, there's a colophon that says, "Reverently made for universal free distribution on behalf of his two parents by Wang Jie." And the date corresponds to May 11th, 868. So this is Wang Jie commissioning the scroll to benefit his deceased parents and to be distributed freely. Woodblock printing allowed for preciseness, and it allowed for an infinite number of copies. So a year later, Paul Pelliot from France arrived, and this is the one picture of all of the objects from the library cave, which have already been piled, but behind it you can see a painting that is still in the library cave, but undoubtedly things have been slightly rearranged. He too purchased a large number of manuscripts and paintings, which are now preserved in the Musée Guimet and the Bibliothèque Nationale. And Paul Pelliot could read he was a polyglot, he knew many languages, and so it was interesting in what he purchased. And its diversity was, as I mentioned in terms of ethnicity, it was a salient feature of Dunhuang and the Silk Road, multi-ethnic, remarkable variety of languages, of religions, cultural and artistic traditions. And as scholar Wu Hong has suggested, Dunhuang was a cosmopolitan center which was a place of constantly changing cross-cultural influence, which energized and sustained Dunhuang over a period of 1,000 years. And there are some surprising finds. This is a letter in Hebrew that was found in the library cave. Part of it is from the Book of Psalms. It's thought to have been folded up and probably been a travel amulet that somebody wore for safekeeping when they were traveling. This is three Christian manuscripts combined together, including the hymn Gloria in Excelsis Deo in Chinese. And just, when you think of it, it attests, there are also other indications of the presence of Christianity. In China, it never took hold on a wide scale, and it's thought that many of the early Christians in China were Central Asians. But there were 8 different manuscripts found in the library cave that were Christian. Also, as one would expect, Buddha Sutras. This is in Chinese, is actually in Chinese and Tibetan. And also, this is a Dharani, which is a difficult to translate sort of prayer that many would say over and over again. Mnemonic device written in Sanskrit with Sogdian. So just these unbelievable manuscript sketches. These were sketches by the wall painters, also the painters who painted the portable things. And paper was so valuable, they would paint on the other side often of a sutra or a written manuscript. And it's wonderful because you can see the way the artist's mind is working. And unlike the West, where there were collectors who collected Rembrandt and Michelangelo's drawings, in China, sketches and drawings were not collected. Particularly, these wall painters were not, they were anonymous artists. And so there were over 60 sketches found in the library cave. And this is a particularly wonderful hand scroll. Also, just one quick sample of the paintings. Bodhisattva as a guide of the souls. This is a lovely painting in the British Museum, which depicts a bodhisattva leading this very elegant Tang lady, the deceased soul, on a cloud raft up to this palace in the upper left. And you can see the beautiful detailing of the hair ornaments. And it's a very typical Tang lady. It's a time when being voluptuous and being slightly on the chubby side was desirable. So it's quite a lovely but beautiful painting. Okay, so before closing, I'd like to just briefly consider preservation and conservation. Who oversees this site? And what is being done to preserve it? Fortunately, the Dunhuang Academy, which is one of China's premier research, conservation, and site management institutions, has a staff of over 100 professionals who oversee this cave site. The Dunhuang Academy has a strong conservation ethic, which emphasizes minimal intervention and retention of historical authenticity. So that means there's no restoration, there's no in-painting. If a chunk of wall painting falls off the wall, it's not in-painted, it's stabilized. But it also applies to the entire site in the need to preserve it intact as it is, and that has kept commercialization and things at a remove, which is terrific. And the partnership with the Getty Conservation Institute, which began in 1989, has certainly been helpful. The Dunhuang Academy is in charge, but the Getty Conservation Institute has brought all of their scientific knowledge and also all the work they do in global standards of conservation to Dunhuang. And in 2004, Dunhuang was designated the National Center for Wall Painting Conservation. So at the top, you see the cliff face in 1907, and then today, after it was reinforced in the 1960s. And all of this has to be continually monitored and examined. Then what are the threats to the site? Sand floods and mass tourism. So the problem of windblown sand. The Mingsha dunes are on top of the cliff face, and during the centuries of abandonment, that sand cascaded over the cliff and moved constantly, bearing the entrance to the caves and accumulating in deep piles and also abrading the paintings. But today, the Getty and the Dunhuang Academy have worked in partnership, and they've worked out a way to control the windblown sand, in part through the wind fence, which is and also through about 15 kilometers of natural plantings and 1 square meter sort of pits dug into the sand with straw rubble at the end, and it traps the sand and actually has controlled about more than 80% of the sand to keep it from blowing down. This is up on the top of the cliff face. But the biggest problem and the most intractable is the problem of increasing visitation. This is Golden Week in October of 2014. Chinese now have new wealth and freedom of movement, and that means burgeoning domestic tourism, which is wonderful, and people being able to travel. But since 2016, the annual number of visitors to Dunhuang has gone from 30,000 to over 2 million. So it requires a terrific amount of site management It certainly is good for the local economy, but it threatens to exceed the carrying capacity of the caves. So the Getty and Dunhuang Academy study of the carrying capacity estimated that the caves can accommodate 6,000 visitors a day, and the problem is on holidays when it exceeds that. They do have online reservations, and that's helping, but it remains an ongoing and ever-increasing problem. One thing that they did do to help with that problem was build a visitor center. When you hear visitor center, you think of a rather boring building, but here it's actually a really beautiful work by Cui Kai, an eminent Chinese architect, and it shows 2 films. The idea is visitors can spend more time here and less time in the caves. So there'll be less CO2, less rising humidity and temperature in the caves. If people spend time here learning about the site through a movie on the history of Dunhuang, and under the 2 domes is a wonderful state-of-the-art digital presentation of many of the best caves. There is also a control room which monitors humidity, temperature, CO2. It also is for security. But if a cave reaches the upper limit in terms of its humidity or CO2 or temperature, they can close the cave and open another cave. As the caves at Lascaux in France are closed and you see a replica cave, here they do have the advantage of having a large number of caves, but they're having to monitor them very carefully in terms of deterioration. So this shows you some of the problems of the losses due to salt and also the lifting of paint. And that's because the rising humidity draws the salts in the rock out to the surface and then pushes the paint layer off, the mud and the paint. And so the Dunhuang Academy started a project on Cave 85, and they spent a decade studying every aspect of it together with the Getty, and with the idea that it could provide a roadmap for conservators at Dunhuang and at other cultural heritage sites. So they've worked out a whole process, and I'm going to be just give a summary, but it examines and documents every inch of the cave, and that precedes any kind of treatment. And then when they do get to treatment of the painting, this is injecting a mud-based grout to prevent further loss, so they stabilize all areas. And so on the left, the loss and the lifting paint, in the center documenting it, then injecting this grout-based fluid, which they worked hard to determine what was the best formula for that. And then they put paper against the painting and press it in and pull the salts out. So that has been the treatment that they have worked out to in terms of most up-to-date conservation techniques and using scientific analysis to slow deterioration and stabilize the cave. But the challenge is huge, and it's never ending. Can you imagine 45,000 square meters of wall painting? So I think sites like this, in terms of remembering how fragile our cultural heritage is when you think of Palmyra and you think of Bamiyan. But the good news at Dunhuang is that the Dunhuang Academy provides responsible and well-informed leadership. They're well-informed professionals, and they're protecting the site and overseeing its conservation and preservation, as well as research and study, so we can be optimistic. And I want to end with a quote, which is at the site: "Whenever faith exists, it will not be altered by human affairs. Those who believe deeply in the Buddha consider it possible that when he arrives, the wind and waves will be calm. Therefore, he will be welcomed to the Dunhuang temples and be worshipped forever." So we can hope for forever. Anyway, thank you very much.